All right. So we should be in. Hi, everyone. Very sorry about the delay in getting started. We had a little bit of tech difficulties logging in, but we're all here now and we're ready to go. And we'll just give it one more minute before we start. All right. So hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Al-Shabaka's Policy Lab series. My name is Tariq, and I'm the Al-Shabaka's US Policy Fellow at the time. So today we're going to be having a very timely policy-focused discussion about calls for sanctions as a tool of holding Israel accountable for its war crimes and human rights violations. But before we get going, I just want to take one more second. I know we're already, a little bit behind. I just want to take one more second to give a big shout out to Nadim Bawalsa, who is, I think, in the audience today after spending months leading Al-Shabaka's Policy Lab. Nadim is going to be handing the reins over to me and other team members so that he can focus on some other projects that he's putting together. So thank you to Nadim for all the hard work you've put into this series. I think we definitely have big shoes to fill, but I hope we can do it. So with that, I want to get started since we're already behind a little bit on this important discussion. Over the last couple of years, Israel's escalation of repression and violence against Palestinians has been met with growing public support internationally for efforts to hold Israel accountable for its actions. And as solidarity with Palestinians rises, so too does support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And in particular, so too does growing calls for actual sanctions against Israel. Yet, despite the growing case for sanctions, they remain a controversial tactic for several reasons. The first are ethical concerns around the use of sanctions that have been informed by their history as a tactic employed by often Western powers and perceived by some as a form of collective punishment. Another concern is around the question of efficacy. Many have made very convincing case that sanctions have rarely actually achieved their intended goals. And while it's obviously unlikely that there's going to be any concerted campaign to sanction Israel in the near future, we really need to think about these questions, these technical questions, in order to formulate coherent and most importantly, realistic policy proposals. So we have a lot of questions to answer, ranging from what sanctions might actually look like applied to this unique case, and whether or not they would be effective. And to answer these questions, I'm joined by Nada, Elia, and Khaled Elgindy. Nada teaches ethnic and cultural studies at Western Washington University. She is the author of Greater Than the Sum of Our Parts, Feminism, Internationalism, and Palestine, which was published earlier this year, and has contributed chapters to numerous anthologies, including The Case for Sanctions Against Israel, which was published in 2020. Khaled Elgindy is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he also directs MEI's program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. He is the author of Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump, which was published in 2019. Khaled previously served as a fellow at Brookings, served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership on permanent status negotiations with Israel from 2004 to 2009, and was a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations of 2007 and 2008. He's also an adjunct instructor in Arab studies at Georgetown University. So just a very quick reminder about the format of this event. I'll be posing questions to Nada and Khaled for the first 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have ample amount of time at the end to get to questions from the audience. So please feel free to submit your questions by clicking on the Ask a Question button on the bottom of your screen. And remember, you can also vote on questions you find particularly interesting or important. And we'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible. So with that, let's begin. I want to start off with you, Nada, and just considering your background and considering the contribution you made to the book, The Case for Sanctions Against Israel. We often discuss sanctions in blanket terms that can at times obscure just how many different types of sanctions there are and how their individual application can vary case by case. So when we're talking about sanctions as a tactic of the BDS movement, and we're calling for sanctions against Israel, what exactly would they entail in practice, and what would they look like?
Well, thanks for having me. And I would like to actually clarify that my chapter in that book is about academic and cultural boycott rather than about sanctions. But obviously, as a boycott activist, I have looked at sanctions, and I think it's actually a really good question. What would sanctions look like? Because the BDS movement, the BNC, the Boycott National Committee, and rightly so, has not specified what type of sanctions should be used against Israel. It hasn't specified any of the campaigns. It's basically, what it has left it up to local organizers to determine what works best, because obviously it's a call for global solidarity, and what's going to be taking place in the US is different from Italy, is different from so many different countries. So we don't actually have very clear guidelines and we have parameters and guidelines, but we don't have this is what sanctions is going to look like. So realistically speaking, as someone in the US, what would US sanctions on Israel going to be like? And obviously they're not going to be anything like the sanctions on Iraq or on Iran. That's just not going to happen. So when we think of, are they going to be punitive? Are they going to be collective punishment? They're not going to be the same sanctions. The sanctions on Iraq were very strict. They were comprehensive. They were economic and trade sanctions. They basically banned everything except for humanitarian aid. And I cannot imagine anytime in the near or foreseeable or long-term future, I can't imagine the US imposing such sanctions on Israel, even in light of all that's coming out finally in the open about Israel being an apartheid state in violation of international law, in violation of the human rights of the Palestinians. I cannot see the same kind of sanctions being imposed. So what would US sanctions on Israel look like in practice? I think, again, realistically speaking, the sanctions would be basically a demand for greater accountability from Israel in how it uses the weapons purchased with the foreign aid we sent to Israel. I mean, everybody's aware of that outrageously overblown figure of $3.8 billion a year. And that's just the, plus tips, plus all the extras, that's an overblown amount of military aid, and basically demanding greater accountability, because that would not be insignificant, because we also know that 75% of the foreign aid we give Israel is earmarked for weapons purchases. And we do have the Leahy laws that say military aid should not be used by forces that engage in gross violations of human rights, that violate the human rights with impunity. So for me, that implementing the Leahy laws, implementing what we already have in place, basically military aid cannot be used by forces that engage in gross violations of human rights, that would be sending the message that we are holding Israel responsible and accountable for its gross human rights violations. I think that is a very ethical form of sanction that totally goes where it needs to be going, rather than oh, well, it's not going to work, it's not going to be effective, it's going to be collective punishment. Oh no, we give you military aid and there are conditions in place, and we just want to make sure that those conditions are met, and we have the system for that.
Thank you, Nada. I think that's helpful for us in framing my next question for Khaled. And Khaled, I'm hoping you can kind of dive into the nitty-gritty of the policy a little bit more. And so to give us some context, in the United States, the country that arguably wields the most power when it comes to the sanctions process that we're discussing, public opinion on Israel-Palestine is shifting. So according to Gallup's most recent poll on the subject, which many in the audience may be already aware of, the majority of Democrats now sympathize more with Palestinians than they do with Israelis. And while these trends are obviously a lot more pronounced on the left, and on the left of the partisan divide and among younger generations, there's widespread growing calls for tangible US foreign policy change, not just from the US public, but from actual members of sitting members of Congress. And most of these calls include conditioning US aid to Israel. And it's important, obviously, like Nada said, to distinguish between, conditioning aid and actual wide-reaching economic sanctions. But do you see a growing public support for actual wider sanctions? And if not, what are the political obstacles that we're facing, that lay in the way of sanctions becoming an actual foreign policy reality?
Yeah, thanks, Tariq, and thanks for having me. So, as we heard from Neda, sanctions come in all different forms and sizes, and when we the sort of sanctions that we typically think of, like the Iraq sanctions in the 1990s or the Gaza blockade, obviously, as we heard from Neda, these are not on the table, right? We're in a very, very limited realm of what is politically feasible when we talk about any type of sanction. So sanctions can be big or small. So we're talking now in the very, very limited realm of maybe some aid conditionality and other kinds of restrictions. First, I think it's important to say, so I'll get to the public opinion question in a moment, but I think it's important to point out that from a policy perspective, sanctions, official government sanctions on an ally or friend of the United States are rare. Think about Egypt and its human rights record. Even though there is a push from members of Congress by both parties for sort of being tougher on Egypt or other American allies in the region and beyond, it's very, very hard to get those kinds of sanctions in place. That is especially true when it comes to, another example would be Saudi Arabia after the Khashoggi murder. There were lots of calls for accountability and sanctions. That special relationship between the US and Saudi remains almost completely unaffected by Khashoggi's murder. So when we talk about Israel, we're in a different level of exceptionalism than any other type of US relationship. As everyone knows, Israel is the largest US aid recipient in the world, $3.8 billion a year. That is a central feature of the special relationship, which is probably the most special of all special relations. At least in the sense that everywhere else, wherever there's US assistance, economic, but also military, there are restrictions. There are no restrictions or conditions or even scrutiny of in any meaningful way on the aid that the US taxpayers give to Israel on an annual basis. So Israel's the only country in the world that gets completely unconditional aid. Not only is it totally unconditional, again, with bipartisan support, Israel also gets a host of special privileges in terms of how that aid is structured, which is mostly in the form of grants that never have to be paid back, right? That's the definition of a grant. And a very large portion of that, unlike other military aid recipients, can be spent on Israel's own military industry. That's different than in other countries that have to spend the money that the US provides on US equipment. So that's in addition to all of the special and exceptional treatment that Israel gets at the economic level, politically and diplomatically, cover the US veto in the Security Council. US is always running interference in the General Assembly or at the Human Rights Council. So really, when we talk about sanctions in relation to Israel, simply withholding any of this special treatment would be considered a sanction, right? Withholding the US veto in the Security Council, that could be a sanction, right? That anything that departs from this exceptional treatment. So the main obstacle to why we haven't seen really any movement even the most limited type of scrutiny, is that there's pretty much a consensus in Washington, in Congress, in the administration, most of the analyst community, that is completely opposed to any type of meaningful sanction on Israel, or even something as minimal as scrutiny. Like, we don't see public hearings, congressional hearings on how U.S. aid is being used in the occupied territories, or how, on Israel's human rights record, or even on things like American charities that are funneling money into Israeli settlements and violent settlers. Right? There is no oversight on any of these issues. So in that sense, there's a lot of space. There's, in terms of policy recommendations, there's a lot that can be done in that realm. I think particularly in the sense of enforcing existing U.S. laws, the Leahy laws, the Arms Export Control Act. I mean, these laws that limit how U.S. military hardware and training and other types of assistance can be used. And so even just applying our own laws, which isn't being done, I think can go a very long way in terms of modifying Israeli behavior and achieving some minimal accountability. Again, something like holding a hearing where you're not imposing some sort of sanctions regime, but we're merely shining a light. There is growing support for shining those lights on Israeli behavior. I think, especially given the direction that Israel is going, both in terms of its treatment of Palestinians, but also in its kind of in the domestic realm, the judicial overhaul and so forth. There's a lot of trepidation, particularly among Democrats, about this blank check that Israel has had for so long. But it's, there's a gap. Public opinion is one thing, and where the politics is another. If public opinion were to dictate the politics, then we'd expect half of Democrats in the Congress would be, supporting Palestinian rights, but we don't even see, 8, 9, 10% of Democrats, and half of that in terms of the overall Congress. So there's a long way to go in terms of translating public opinion first into political change and then into some sort of policy change.
Thank you, Khaled. I think, I might want to dive back onto that topic of moving from, public opinion to policy. But for now, before we, move on a little bit too far from this, we're still kind of in this area, I want to take a quick step back, and I'd like to hear both of your thoughts on this. So while recognizing that sanctions in this specific case, won't look like anything like sanctions that we've seen elsewhere in the region, I want to talk about, some of the ethical concerns that are often raised. Critics of sanctions say that they can amount to a form of collective punishment. And is there, any weight to this critique when considering the fact that sanctions on Israel be far less sweeping than examples, that we've seen elsewhere? And along that vein, are there any, ethical risks that we should be considering? And maybe, Nada, we could start with you.
No, I think in my mind, there's a very clear distinction. I mean, again, what Khaled has just outlined as all of the possible sanctions that he just outlined, none of them are going to actually hurt the Israeli people if we're thinking of the Israeli people. And it is odd that as an oppressed people, we actually should be thinking of the comfort level of our oppressor. But that's basically what the question is. What is the comfort level of the oppressor? Are we being engaging in collective punishment of the Israeli people when basically the Israeli people are engaging in collective punishment of the Palestinian people? But that consideration, major consideration aside, considering what those sanctions are going to look like, honestly, there's little reason to fear for the comfort level. And I'm intentionally being very sarcastic here, because we've got a country that has been engaged in gross human rights violations since its very foundation 75 years ago. And yet we're thinking, is it ethical? Is it unethical? But besides that, there's a very clear distinction between sanctions imposed upon a people who are already oppressed by their leaders, such as Iran or Iraq or many of the countries where there are sanctions, and sanctions imposed upon a country, meaning Israel or a people, the Israeli people, that has elected its leaders again and again. In the latter case, such as Israel, this is the people that has elected its political leaders, and imposing the kind of sanctions that we are talking about is simply a form of accountability, a form of consequences. It's not collective punishment. It does not penalize the people as much as holding them accountable for their political decisions. The fact that they have chosen leaders who are imposing these conditions, who are enacting the human rights violations. Demanding accountability of Israel in that case is nothing like imposing sanctions on, again, Iraq or Iran. I'm going to talk about Iran a little, because Iran, until the very recent Russian invasion of Ukraine, Iran has been subjected to the most sanctions in the world since 1979. And looking at Iran, we're looking at imposing drastic sanctions on a people that is actually rebelling against its own political leadership, that is oppressed by its own political leadership. So this, in that case, is absolutely collective punishment. The people don't necessarily approve of what their leaders are doing, and the sanctions are extremely harsh, and they are actually hurting the people. What we see in Israel, on the other hand, is very, very different. We see a country that, since a people that since the foundation of the country is very much at ease with the oppression of the indigenous population, which is what their government is engaging in. We see a people that does not view al-Nakba as catastrophic as much as something to celebrate. And, many observers today are commenting on the fact that the dispossession, the settlements, the assassination, the displacement are all sanctioned by the Israeli government. And what we are seeing today is no different than what happened in 47 to 49 during the Nakba. So again, that's a people that has elected this path for their country, that has elected all of the leaders that are engaging in this. And Israel is in violation of international law. It is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. And the Israeli people are actually mostly comfortable with that. The protests that we are seeing today are not a protest against Israel's violation of international law and the human rights of the Palestinians. There are protests against Israel's overhaul of the judicial system that's going to impact those who are privileged by that judicial system rather than those who are oppressed by Israel's apartheid system. They're not protesting against the projected changes that impact them, rather than protesting the settlements, protesting the raids on Nablus, protesting the raising of Bedouin villages. So sanctions on a people that is comfortable with apartheid, which privileges them, is not going to be collective punishment. It's going to be accountability. I describe these sanctions, minimal as they are going to be, as an end to Israeli exceptionalism and a demand for accountability. They will not have the impact of collective punishment as much as, you know what? This is going too far. This has gone too far. It's accountability. It's an end to exceptionalism, not collective punishment.
Yeah, thank you, Ned. I think that's a very critical distinction, and I think what you said at the beginning about wondering why an oppressed people should have to consider the comfort levels of their oppressor is kind of goes to the root of this question. And Khaled, before we jump into another question, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that same topic.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of quick things. I mean, I think it's true that sanctions regimes, when we talk about an actual regime like in Iraq or in the past or Iran today, those are a very blunt instrument, and their negative effects tend to go far beyond their ostensible targets. The devastation of the 1990s of Iraq throughout the 1990s, the Gaza blockade, the Iran sanctions today. These are devastating ordinary Iranians or ordinary people who have, frankly, no say in the policies of their governments. And so, yes, I think sanctions regimes can be very, very harmful. And at the end of the day, the track record is not good in terms of their success. I think one could make a very compelling argument that the sanctions regime against Iraq in the 1990s is one of the things that helped keep the Saddam Hussein regime in power, in large part because people became more dependent on the regime for basic subsistence and survival. I think one can make a similar argument about Hamas in Gaza. So, but I think as already been made clear, we're not talking about, in terms of Israel, we're not talking about anything like those kinds of sweeping broad sanctions regimes. And so the question of collective punishment, I think, doesn't even factor in. It's a moot point.
Mm-hmm.
And so the only other point I would add is Neda mentioned Iran and also the Russian case. I think the irony here is that the one party in this arrangement that is subjected to broad sweeping sanctions by the United States are the Palestinians. At every level, diplomatically, there's no more. The PLO embassy was shut down. The U.S. Mission to the Palestinians historically, the consul general, has also been shut down. They've eliminated almost all types of aid thanks to the Taylor Force Act and the new laws like ATCA. The Biden administration has restored some minimal humanitarian aid to the Jerusalem Hospital Network and some other things, but for the most part, aid has been entirely eliminated, and of course, there are all sorts of other congressional restrictions on Palestinians, not least of which is representation here in Washington. So, the Palestinians are probably third in terms of the one international group that faces the most sweeping sanctions by the U.S. government. Sanctioning Israel on some level, even if we're not talking about sweeping sanctions regimes, we also need to talk about relieving some of the sanctions and punitive measures that have been put in place over the past 30, 40 years on the Palestinians. Otherwise, it's an incomplete discussion if we're only talking about putting some restrictions on Israel, but we also have to lift the restrictions that Palestinians are under. If we want to have some sort of equitable, reasonable policy position that is credible, right? If we're putting all the pressure on the weak side and giving all the goodies to the stronger side, then we are participating and essentially responsible for maintaining the status quo and for the continued occupation and oppression of Palestinians. And that is essentially what the U.S. role is we are a partner in Israel's repression of Palestinians.
Thanks, Khaled. I think it's often overlooked that yes, this question goes both ways, and yes, when you really look at it, Palestinians are the ones who are facing much more far-reaching sanctions than the traditional understanding of the term. With that, I want to kind of zoom in on and I want to stick with you, Khaled, on this question. So this is the question I find most interesting, and so when we're discussing we're discussing the case for sanctions against Israel. They're obviously comparatively minimal in reach when compared to the sanctions regimes that you mentioned, Khaled. And in these case, like in this specific case, calls for sanctions have mostly been limited to actions like conditioning military aid based on existing U.S. law. So again, I want to emphasize that word minimal in comparison to other sanctions regimes that we've seen in the past. But that leads me to ask, what impact would sanctions have, or what impact would these measures have on actually affecting Israel's calculations? And the core of the question is: are we expecting too much when it comes to the prospect of actually coercing Israeli behavior through soft power tactics such as BDS and conditioning aid and calling for sanctions?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're asking too much because we're asking for very little. to begin with. So, we're talking about enforcing existing U.S. law, not passing new laws that would sanction Israel. Let's just enforce existing laws, like the Leahy laws, like the Arms Export Control Act. Let's, as Neda very rightly said, let's de-exceptionalize Israel. The reality is that going from a place of privilege and exceptionalism to a place of normalcy is itself seen as a sanction, is seen as punitive, right? If you're accustomed to impunity and special treatment, then any retreat from that feels like oppression, right? So we need to get over that hump by simply normalizing, de-exceptionalizing the U.S.-Israel relationship. First and foremost, Israel will remain an ally of the United States, a special relationship on some level. But there are certain things that go above and beyond even special relationships. And I think simple things like congressional hearings on certain types of Israeli policies, the use of American military assistance, how American military assistance is being used. This is perfectly reasonable and consistent with the mission of Congress, which is to oversee how the executive does business and also to oversee how their appropriated funding is being used. All of this is, I think, it's not currently on the table, but it is, I think, plausible with some political shifts in the coming years. Even something like calling for an official investigation into the murder of an American citizen, Shireen Abu Akleh, which is actually common, for example, for the FBI to launch its own investigation whenever a U.S. citizen is killed in difficult circumstances overseas. The administration has been reluctant to do that and has tried to sweep the issue under the rug. So even something like that, again, congressional hearings on the killing of U.S. citizens, on the treatment of Palestinian Americans who travel to Israel, on any aspect of the U.S.-Israel relationship, all of those, I think, could significantly impact Israel's behavior. And then, of course, things like not opposing Security Council resolutions. Those would, I think, almost certainly modify Israeli behavior. If the U.S. hadn't consistently blocked, every time a war breaks out in Gaza, the U.S. is there blocking Security Council attempts, even when there's unanimity outside of the United States, in having the Security Council call for an immediate ceasefire, the U.S. blocks it. Withholding that veto, I think, could go a long way, even towards just mitigating some of the violence so that it doesn't drag on as long as it usually does, instead of working quietly behind the scenes. Openly criticizing Israeli policies of the settlements or human rights abuses. This is another way to modify Israeli behavior because it's a departure from what Israel is accustomed to. So I think a lot of little things can go a very long way, even if they're not going to ultimately, end Israel's occupation regime in its entirety. They can mitigate some of the worst aspects on the ground, people being expelled from their homes, people being killed on a daily basis. What the U.S. says and does, even small things, matters a great deal to Israel. And so I wouldn't underestimate what the U.S. could do in terms of modifying Israeli behavior.
Thank you, Khaled. Neda, I just want to get your thoughts on that question about whether they would be effective as well in changing Israel's calculations before I ask one more question, and then we can get into some Q&As.
I'm more of a Khaled is amazing at advocacy and legislative advocacy. I'm more of a grassroots kind of person. My activism, my organizing is at the grassroots level. And what I think is changing the perception of Israel. That's why I say de-exceptionalizing Israel at the grassroots level, because there's also a perception at the grassroots level that Israel is, the greatest, the only democracy in the Middle East. And that perception has changed, and the demand for sanctions would also change that perception. Let me clarify. When I discuss BDS, and I very frequently talk about BDS. When I discuss BDS, I always emphasize that it's a form of economic activism, but that its ultimate goal is not making a dent in Israel's economy. That's not what we're not trying to hurt Israel's economy. But when we talk to people about, for example, boycotting Sabra, we explain why, because Sabra sponsors the Gilani and Givati brigades that are notorious for human rights violations. That's why we have to boycott Sadra. Same thing with SodaStream. Why do we boycott SodaStream, and so on? We are actually explaining the biggest success of BDS, the biggest accomplishment of BDS has not been making a dent in Israel's economy, even though BDS is a form of economic activism. It has educated the people, and it has, changed people's perception of Israel. And eventually, I'm a believer in the grassroots organizing, because change does come rises from the grassroots up. I think, in my view, oppression is a trickle-down process. Oppression is from the government to the people, and social progress is from the people up. And so, again, when we demand sanctions, it is our most direct, popular expression of our disapproval of Israel's criminal practices. And looking at history, popular dissent, popular demand for change does rise from the grassroots up. And so demanding sanctions, again, it's not going to make a dent in Israel's economy. It's not, but will it then encourage the 8 or 9% of Democrats to speak in greater numbers? Yes, because they actually do. I mean, they're called leaders, but they're followers. They're followers of public opinion, right? So make our demand for sanctions is our clearest expression of the fact that we don't like what Israel is doing. Again, it's boycott, divestment, and sanctions. All three of them are considered and understood as forms of economic activism, but their impact is not economic. And their impact is a change in public perception that eventually rises from the grassroots to the top. I mean, I could go on and explain, like the legalization of gay marriage, of interracial marriage, desegregation. All of these started at the grassroots, and eventually our political leaders, our so-called leaders who are ultimately followers, eventually accepted it and made it official, but it started at the grassroots. So the demand for sanctions is a grassroots demand that eventually will hopefully translate into some kind of government action.
I'm very glad you emphasized the grassroots and the history, because that's a perfect segue into my next question. Nada, again, stick with you for this, but we often, refer to the global struggle against apartheid in South Africa when we're advocating for sanctions against Israel and a similar strategy. What lessons do you think we can learn from that experience, considering just how different the Palestinian struggle is from that specific context? What can we take away? What worked? What didn't work? And what could possibly work in this case?
Yeah. I think we have a lot to learn from. I mean, I would actually recommend that you do a whole webinar on the lessons learned from the South African struggle, because there is so much that we can learn from that struggle to end apartheid in South Africa. And most of us are aware of the similarities, of course. So I'm going to focus on the differences. The similarities, I think, again, we don't need to talk about these, but there are very major differences, and we need to learn from the differences rather than from the similarities. One of the major differences between the struggle to end apartheid in South Africa and today's struggle to end apartheid in Israel and decolonization, of course, is that Palestinians don't have the equivalent of the ANC, the African National Congress. The African National Congress was a political party, not the only one, but a very, very major player, a political party that was also fully engaged in activism and resistance. We do not have a major political party that most Palestinians are rallying behind, that is a recognized official political party that is fully engaged in activism and resistance. Clearly, it is not the PA. The PA is engaged in making concessions and subcontracting the occupation, it's subcontracting security. So we don't have that. The PA is not about tending to the needs of the Palestinian people. If anything, it is an arm of the oppression of the Palestinian people. We're also more fragmented. We're much more of a diaspora people than the Black South Africans ever were, right? So we have that fragmentation. I think actually the fragmentation, even though it's a geographical fragmentation, I don't necessarily see it as a political fragmentation, and I don't see it as, the old will die and the young will forget. I can tell you any number of young Palestinians today in the diaspora who know exactly where they're from. So, the fragmentation is a geographical fragmentation, which makes it more challenging. And I'm just like listing some of the differences, but I don't see it as a huge obstacle. And it is something, that fragmentation, we're seeing more and more calls for unity, and not just calls for unity, but we are seeing the Palestinian people coming together again. But for me, the most important lesson comes not from looking at the struggle, but from looking at post-apartheid South Africa as a cautionary tale. It's really important to look at South Africa today, and very sadly, the circumstances of Black South Africans today are barely improved over what they were under the harshest years of apartheid. Blacks are still living in shanty towns, they are still destitute, they are still lacking the most basic educational and health needs. And this is because ending apartheid in South Africa was not done with an institutional program to redress the decades of wrong, decades. And if you don't do that, ending apartheid alone does not magically fix things. The end of apartheid in South Africa was not accompanied by a redistribution of land, wealth, power, and resources. It was end apartheid, right? And the Blacks did not get their land back, did not get access to resources. So again, looking at South Africa, I think of it as a cautionary tale. Today in South Africa, the extreme poverty of Blacks, compounded by, and I'm a feminist, and so I'm always looking at gender dynamics also. The extreme poverty of Blacks in South Africa, compounded by the established pattern of understanding masculinity as control over women in a traditionally patriarchal society, has aggravated gender-based violence in South Africa. And I'm going to also, we have an aggravation of gender-based violence in Palestine. Today, South Africa is the rape capital of the world, right? Because of the decades of oppression that have not been redressed with the official end of apartheid, and because in a traditionally patriarchal society, men do understand power as control, not all men, understand power as control over, the more vulnerable, or control over women. So we see the same thing happening in Palestine right now. Sadly, we have to be realistic. We're also witnessing misogyny and femicides on the rise in Palestine. And that's, again, directly attributed to the extremely harsh circumstances at the macro level. We always have to understand oppression at the micro level and the macro level. And, the macro level of oppression trickles down into the micro level, which, the family household. So as we have a macro level of oppression, which is social, political, economic, in a traditionally patriarchal society, that translates into oppression at the family house, within the family household. So in addition to ending apartheid, we also have to address all of the levels of oppression that will trickle down. So we need to be very intentional about, again, looking at South Africa, not just addressing the roots of oppression, meaning Israeli apartheid and the dispossession of the Palestinian people. But we also have to be very aware about addressing the long-term consequences of that oppression, the social ills that have resulted from that oppression, the macro level of oppression and the social ills that have resulted from it. And we need to look at and provide for the needs of the marginalized, who are today's oppressed, most vulnerable people. They're the disabled, they're the traumatized, there's those who have been tortured in Israeli jails, those who have lost their lands. If we don't have a holistic approach to liberation, and I think that the South African struggle to end apartheid was not a holistic approach to liberation. It tried, but it wasn't. If we don't have a holistic approach to liberation, there can be no real justice and no redress. If we only end the system of apartheid in Israel, but don't ensure that Palestinians get their land back and reparation and the necessary social services, the inequality will unfortunately remain. And for me, that's the biggest lesson we learned from South Africa, that ending apartheid in South Africa did not end the injustice. If we end apartheid in Israel without addressing all of the social services needs, without addressing the increased misogyny, without addressing the fact that we have a generation of disabled, maimed people, traumatized, who have been in prisons, who have lost their loved ones, if we don't have the social services for that, if we don't have environmentally conscious programs, if we don't have all of what it takes, ending apartheid is not going to solve the problems, just like it did not in Israel, in South Africa, where we still have extreme poverty, extreme misogyny, extreme, basic lack of the most basic needs, even though apartheid officially was abolished.
Thanks, Nada. So, what you're saying is basically like the process has only just begun, and I think you raised a very important point, because you're right. We do often approach analyzing the example of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa from, the very initial, focus, just focusing on, what was kind of the more tangible and bringing down that specific regime, but a lot is missed when we don't discuss what followed. Again, that's we could talk about this for hours. Unfortunately we only have 3 minutes, so I want to close out one question from the crowd that I think both of you could quickly respond to. But it seems that one of the main takeaways from this whole conversation is that what we're calling for when we're calling for accountability falls far short of this word sanctions that is, and how it's commonly interpreted, right? And what we're calling for example, the bare minimum of conditioning U.S. aid and U.S. military aid to Israel really doesn't fit with most ideas, people's understanding of sanctions. And I think somebody asked a good question in the audience. If we're just calling for accountability and very minimal demands that are kind of just the bare minimum, is there any risk to labeling these as sanctions at all? Does that turn people away and make it seem bigger than it is? Because you're right, at the end of the day, we are just calling for the bare minimum. Khaled, what do you think about that? And then Nada, maybe we can finish with you.
Generally, I think people, particularly policymakers, are going to be more amenable to positive language versus negative language. I think sanctions and punitive measures generally will turn people off, especially in such a beloved issue like Israel. It's very difficult to get policymakers to think in those terms. On the other hand, I think talking about accountability is something that would resonate with a lot of people. These are terms that even the Biden administration uses, and they even called for accountability in the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, right? They obviously fell short in terms of what was actually needed for real accountability, but they believe in the principle. So I think accountability is a very important, not just rhetorical point or semantic issue. I think it is the crux of the issue. Sanctions are ultimately about accountability. And the idea is that when there is a price to be paid for certain kinds of behavior, then the people who engage in that behavior will think twice about when there are consequences. And so that is the fundamental principle behind it. And I think it's an appropriate one. It's one that belongs in our foreign policy. We need to have more accountability, especially not just of our adversaries, but especially of U.S. allies in the region and beyond, and starting with the most special of all relationships with Israel. We can't simply continue to give Israel a blank check and expect Israel's behavior to change. That's insanity. And so there has to be some accountability, and it needs to come from the United States, but also other actors like the European Union, maybe even the Arab states can play a role, especially those who are who've been eager to normalize with Israel. There are lots of things that governments can do to promote minimal kinds of accountability with significant effects on the ground.
Thank you, Khaled. And Nada, any final words to close this out?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd actually never thought of BDS becoming BDA because BDS stands for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and we are asking for accountability. We are asking for de-exceptionalization. So I am a little bit cautious about constructive words and positive words, because I do remember that Ronald Reagan, of course, when the American people was asking for sanctions, was proposing constructive engagement, right? That was the positive thing. And I don't want, the US to be asking for constructive engagement with the Israeli apartheid regime. I do want accountability, and if people, if the government is going to possibly be cautious about the use of the word sanctions, again, as far as someone who works at the grassroots level rather than the advocacy level, I would say I still want to demand sanctions. And if they understand it as accountability, then that's the government's interpretation. But,
Yeah, I think, yeah, thank you, Nada. I think, again, you kind of leave us at this point where I think there's a lot more to talk about, and unfortunately, we're all out of time for this conversation today. But I think this discussion is going to continue offline, and I can say now that Al-Shabaka is going to be doing some more research and writing on it in the coming months. But thank you, Nada, thank you, Khaled, thank you everybody for taking this hour out of your day. Apologies again for a little bit of a late start, but I'm really glad that we had this conversation. And before we sign off, I'd like to remind everybody that these policy labs are a crowd-funded program of Al-Shabaka. So we would be very thankful for any contributions that you can make to ensure that these can keep going. And if you are able to donate, please do so by clicking the donate button that should appear on your screens. And thank you again for coming, and please stay tuned for our next lab that will be next month, and announcements will go out. Thanks again, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.